Maybe we jump in first with is there like strategies around just the way you're kind of fueling your day-to-day nutrition with carbohydrates that are a little more conducive to what you're going to be able to do when you're out there training?
Yeah, and so what I think you're getting at there is talking about gut training, right? So,
Hmm.
when we talk about gut training, and of course, the primary fuel source that we're going for during exercise is carbohydrate, even in the ultra space. So it's really kind of figuring out how we can get our gut, which, you know, what does that even mean? I mean, we're mostly referring to the stomach and intestines when we say that, right? The GI tract is, of course, involves many more organs, but that's what we're really talking about. And it's how can we get the gut to tolerate more volume, more fluid, and absorb more carbohydrate without the GI distress that so many people unfortunately experience in the endurance space. And so what's interesting about gut training is, people always think about, as you're kind of alluding to, it's like, yes, of course, the before, the during, that's really important about kind of practicing all of that. But people kind of forget that what you eat day to day also influences your ability to digest and absorb carbohydrate without as many issues. And of course, as many things are, like, we need more research in this space, right? But we do know that a higher carbohydrate diet can influence kind of the activity of the transporters and how many transporters we have in the intestine, and thus kind of allow for a greater absorption and oxidation of carbohydrate during exercise as well. So if we think about, okay, well, day to day, and I guess how I like to think about this just more holistically. So, we're talking mostly about carbohydrate today, but of course we can't just think about one nutrient. We are interested in all the nutrients as athletes. So if we think about kind of building a really solid foundation with our daily diet, and then a really solid sports nutrition plan kind of goes on top of that, right? So you can't really have one without the other. You can't have, like, even if you have your daily eating like really dialed and then your sports nutrition is just a complete mess and you're winging it, whatever, like, that's not great. But then you can have your sports nutrition totally dialed, but then if you're not eating enough day to day, then that's not going to be great either. So I always like to really remind people to think of both of these things together, and they're just building off of one another. And so when it comes to kind of the daily intake of carbohydrate, we we know that carbohydrates are so important as a fuel source during exercise, especially during longer duration activity, and especially during higher intensity activity, right? And we also have to remind ourselves that carbohydrates are so important for so many other aspects of health. So it's a primary energy source for the brain. It helps protect your muscle, or preserve your muscle mass and protect your bones. It can help in some cases with iron absorption, with heart health, with gut health. I mean, there's so many things that carbohydrates are so important for, aside from exercise. So again, I know sometimes athletes can be really like, single, have the single focus on performance. But again, I like to remind people, like, to think about things a little more holistically. But when it comes to, okay, well, what are the guidelines for research-based guidelines for carbohydrate intake? We're typically looking at that range of 5 to 12 grams of kilogram per kilogram of body weight per day. So that's often where endurance athletes are falling, somewhere between that. And we can kind of break it down by thinking about, okay, well, yes, we're making these little like day-to-day shifts. Like, one of the things you talked about, on your own podcast, but you talked about on my show too, is kind of how you change up your own carbohydrate intake from one day to the next, from one training phase to another training phase. And so we do want to think about those things, both like day to day, like how are we shifting things around, but then also zooming out a little bit and thinking, oh, well, what's the volume like this week? What are things doing? So, if you're at a really low volume, maybe it's like less than an hour a day on average of easy effort, maybe like even 3 to 4 grams per kilogram is enough for you. But then kind of as you progress, whether it's in duration of easy efforts or intensity of slightly shorter efforts, that's kind of where we gradually build and build in this kind of framework of that 5 to 12. So, maybe like more of a moderate volume intensity of, say, like 1 to 2 hours per day of easy effort, or a shorter kind of intense, maybe that's more in that 5 to 7 grams per kilogram. And again, we kind of step up with that 10 to 12 gram per kilogram being carbohydrate loading or very, very high volume or intensity. So we think about that. And then the other thing I like to tell people too is, like, guidelines, they're there for a reason. They're based in research. They're quoted heavily all over the place. They're not rules though, right? They're guidelines. So sometimes people get really freaked out because they calculate these numbers and they sound insanely high from what they're used to doing. And so even though I'm still advising that people work up to this level, like, again, these are goals, these are targets, and we can play around with stuff. And I know you're like the king of playing around and experimenting and all that. So, you do want to kind of think about what is my, like, what makes sense for me, what feels good to me, what types of carbohydrates I'm having. Again, this is something we talked about, like, fiber, like higher fiber carbohydrates, which have so much more volume in your stomach versus kind of lower fiber, simpler, easier to digest carbohydrates. So there's a lot of places we can go with this, but that's the general way I'm talking about it with people.
Yeah, that was perfect. I was going to follow up with a question with the recommendations, because that's always an interesting one to me, because that number does sort of get thrown around. I don't know if it's intentionally casually, but it can be easy to be interpreted that way if you're kind of skimming things or not diving deep into what a conversation or something is referring to. And the way I always try to explain it is like, if we look at that range, because that's a pretty big range, 5 to 12 grams. And I think like, well, if we took someone like Connor Mance and look at his like typical workload and skewed him down to that 5 gram per kilogram, that is going to likely make up a minority macronutrient for him on a big training day. So you sort of have the situation where it's context specific with the individual's lifestyle, but it's also context specific within what they're doing inside their lifestyle. Because like all of us, Connor Mance also has an off-season rest days and things like that. So then there maybe is some opportunity for him to still be in the higher carb category at 5 grams per day, but probably not on his 20-mile long run with 12 miles of goal marathon pace in it or whatever he happens to be doing.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, I don't know, I have no idea what Connor Mance does for his diet, so I can't comment on that. But yeah, I mean, what I always, on a, like the big takeaway and like on the most basic level, I just am always trying to tell people with carbs and just generally with what they're eating, we have to match like how you're feeling yourself to the work you're doing, right? So again, like the basic thing is as you step up how much volume and or intensity you're doing, the more carbohydrates you need, the more total energy intake you need. Protein needs are going up, fat needs, like everything's kind of scaling up, but like we do really focus on carbohydrate because that is such a big fuel source for people. So that's kind of that takeaway that I'm having people keep with them, at least on a basic level.
Mm-hmm. When you're working with athletes and you kind of do an assessment of what they've been doing and you determine, okay, this person is low on their carbohydrates in terms of what we'd like them to be for what their goals are, is that something where you're going to gradually work that up over time? Or is it something where you can start kind of being a little more aggressive with increasing their carbohydrate intake quite quickly and notice some of the performance advantages?
I'm always very gradual with anything I do. So in the daily diet, first of all, I'd much rather someone be adherent and be able to sustain a change that we make than, kind of try something and set themselves up to like not be able to do it. So typically, like I work with a lot of recreational, like very competitive, but recreational endurance athletes and other types of athletes. Everyone's very busy, and they might be dealing with other issues too. So maybe they're already dealing with GI issues, which, let's not load like a ton more carbohydrates on someone's gut or any other change. So yeah, I'm typically having them make small gradual changes and noticing those shifts and seeing how they're feeling. With carbohydrate, we also want to increase our fluid intake. So if you were to, and especially if you're also increasing fiber, we want to do that slowly. We want to add more fluid to that. The last thing we want is for you to be like bloated and constipated and just not feeling well, as that can happen if you increase carbs too fast, increase fiber too fast. I've had people, just come to me after having increased protein really quickly because of all the protein craziness going on right now. And they're like, oh, I suddenly need so much protein. And they're like suffering all these GI issues. And they come to me and we're like working it out. So yeah, I always advise make some kind of small shifts and maybe you're making a bunch of small shifts throughout the day. So it's not like all we're doing is adding, okay, just add one more piece of toast or add a glass of juice here or there. It's like, hey, yeah, maybe you're adding one piece of toast here and you're adding another fruit there and you're adding one more spoon of rice there. You're kind of just gradually shifting things and increasing your fluid intake. And then again, if we are shifting carbohydrate, again, in the daily diet, so we're not talking about intra-workout yet, we are paying attention to fiber, right? So because as I said, we don't like, yes, we want you to get enough fiber. Typically we're aiming for 30 to 40 grams per day. But if you are only consuming like 15 or 20 grams right now, you don't want to suddenly double that. Like, again, we want to be slow with that. And there's the other concern of you might be filling up really quickly, and we have to maybe rely a little bit more on these easier to digest, kind of simpler carbohydrate sources to make sure you're getting enough in. So we're constantly kind of balancing all these different things, also things like food preferences and whatever else, other goals you're working on. So there are a lot of things when I'm working one-to-one with someone, like we are taking lots of different things into account. And then when it comes to intra-workout stuff, similarly, like if we're taking the before, like I always like to say, okay, well, with anything we're doing, whether it's daily diet or intra-workout, we always want to assess what is your baseline? What are you currently doing now? How's it feeling? How's it going? And we go from there. So if someone is coming to me and they're not eating anything before working out, I'm not going to be like, great, yeah, let's go straight to doing like 1 gram per kilogram of carbohydrate. Like, no, like maybe, especially if they're a little scared or they've had GI issues or something, like maybe we're starting with, they're having a little sports drink, they're having a bite of a banana, they're having a graham cracker. Like we might start really small, but we're trying to be consistent and gradually increasing but like the consistency piece is important, but seeing what can you tolerate and keep trying and practicing and getting some fluids in. Maybe we're starting with a sport product, maybe we're starting with a very simple carbohydrate. And then similarly, if our goal is let's get you to 60 grams per hour or whatever the goal might be, and you're at 30, I'm not going to bring you to 60. I'm going to say, hey, let's aim for 40, maybe 45. Let's take that for a little bit of time, see how that feels. And then, of course, we're thinking about where it's coming from, what types of products. We're looking at hydration strategies because hydration can play into GI issues. And so that it's, with all this stuff, that's what's always tricky is like we're dealing with so many layers of things going on. So it can get a little bit complicated.
Yeah, absolutely. There is probably just a little bit of individual trial and error that's part of the game, but I think if you look at it that way, you can not freak out when something happens and make an adjustment. I know with my experience, I was probably overly aggressive based on like your description with respect to the shifting of the daily nutrition stuff. I mean, I went pretty 180 very quickly with that. And I did notice early on the fiber side of things was like, yeah, with this volume of food I'm taking in, I probably need to be mindful of what carbohydrate sources I'm gravitating towards and saving some of the more fiber rich ones maybe for the end of the day after my workouts were done and I had more space between then and the next training session. The one that I was a lot more gradual though with the introduction of intra workout stuff where I did kind of layer that up a little more gradually over time. I don't know what would have happened if I would have gotten more aggressive. Maybe that would have been fine, but I did it the way you described, I guess. So I'm not going to look back and change it now.
Yeah, I mean, and this is again, like with all this stuff, I mean, everyone is so different.
Mhm.
Every time I say, oh, be careful of fiber before a workout, I'll get like a client that eats black beans and is fine or whatever. It's like
Right.
there will always be people who are outliers or who have iron stomachs, and there will be people on the other extreme, right? So anytime we're kind of listing general recommendations or all these things, it's because generally speaking, a large number of people, this would be helpful. But there were, again, this is why it's so important to try all this stuff yourself, to know your body, to know what you tolerate and don't tolerate, and also to not like, especially with gut stuff, like to know it's not set in stone. Like we can train the gut. It's as we train our muscles when we're training, just training for a race or whatever, things can change. And I say this from
Mhm.
personal experience. When I started out distance running, my stomach was a mess, largely because I was underfueling at the time unintentionally. But I mean, I had like my first marathon was a GI disaster. And for years, I was so scared and scarred from that trauma of like having to basically poop between two cars in Paris. And, it was just like, never again. But then I realized I'm like, I'm fine. I just needed to train my stomach. I needed to start eating enough. I don't have issues like that anymore. So yeah. So just not thinking like, oh, this is just how it is. One thing, many dietitians often say is like, just because something is common, it doesn't mean it's normal. And you also don't have to just accept that as your reality. Right. So,
Mhm.
don't be afraid to kind of keep playing around, and also don't like feel like despair, like, oh, all hope is lost. I'll be like this forever.